Welcome to BitBlitz Horror. Tonight's story, The Homunculi, follows Gina as she's hunted by eerie, unnatural beings with a sinister purpose. If you love chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more horror. Now let's dive in. The Homunculi. I first noticed them on a Tuesday. It was one of those gray, unremarkable days that slides past without leaving a mark. I was walking home from the library, my arms weighed down by books I'd never finish, when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, not the casual glance of a passerby or the fleeting attention of a stranger, but something deeper, more invasive. The kind of gaze that sinks into your skin and settles there like an itch you can't scratch. I turned around, expecting to see someone, a jogger, maybe, or a nosy neighbor. But the street behind me was empty. Just rows of parked cars and the skeletal branches of winter trees. I shook it off and kept walking, chalking it up to paranoia. But as I reached my apartment building and fumbled with my keys, the feeling returned, sharper this time. My hand froze mid-turn. That's when I saw them. They were perched on the low stone wall across the street, half hidden in the shadows cast by a flickering streetlight. At first glance, they looked like children, small and slight, with pale faces and dark eyes that seemed too large for their heads. But something about them was wrong. Their proportions were off, their limbs too thin and their movements unnervingly precise. They didn't fidget or shift their weight like kids do. They just sat there, perfectly still, watching me. I told myself they were just neighborhood kids playing some weird game. Maybe their parents had dressed them up in strange costumes for some reason. Though what kind of parent lets their kids out after dark in the middle of winter? Still, I couldn't shake the unease curling in my stomach as I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. By Wednesday, they were everywhere. I saw them peeking out from behind parked cars as I walked to work. One crouched beneath a bench at the bus stop, its head cocked at an unnatural angle as it tracked my every move. Another stood on the roof of a nearby building, silhouetted against the overcast sky like some grotesque gargoyle. They never approached me, at least not then, but their presence was constant, oppressive. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Maybe I'd been working too hard or reading too many horror novels late at night. But no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't deny what I was seeing, or how they made me feel. That evening, as I sat in my living room pretending to read one of the library books, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the noise. One of them was standing on the fire escape outside. It pressed its tiny hands against the glass, its face so close that its breath fogged up the pane. Its eyes, black and bottomless, bored into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment neither of us moved. Then it tilted its head ever so slightly and smiled. The smile wasn't human. It stretched too wide across its face, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that gleamed in the dim light. My stomach churned as I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp in my haste to get away. The sound seemed to startle it. It blinked once before scuttling away on all fours like some kind of insect. I didn't sleep that night. By Thursday morning, I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. The homunculi, I didn't know what else to call them, were growing bolder. They no longer confined themselves to lurking outside. Now they slipped into my home when my back was turned, leaving behind small but unmistakable signs of their presence. A cup moved from one side of the counter to the other while my back was turned. A drawer left slightly ajar when I knew I'd closed it. And always that faint tapping at the windows and doors, as if they were testing for weaknesses. I packed a bag with whatever clothes and essentials I could grab and booked a room at a motel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, a dingy little place with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew, but it felt safer than staying at home. For a while it worked. The homunculi didn't seem to follow me there. Or if they did, they kept their distance. But even as I began to relax, A new fear took root in my mind. Why me? What had drawn these creatures to me in the first place? And what did they want? Friday brought answers, though not the kind I wanted. It started with a knock at my motel door around noon. My heart sank as I peered through the peephole and saw an unfamiliar man standing outside. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken cheeks and eyes that seemed too bright for his hollow face. "Miss Gina?" he asked when I cracked open the door just enough to see him properly. "Who are you?" My voice came out sharper than intended, but he didn't seem offended. "My name is Dr. Elias Crane," he said calmly. "I believe you're being followed." My blood ran cold at his words. "How do you know that?" "Because they've followed others before you," he replied grimly. "May I come in?" "There's much we need to discuss." Against my better judgment, and driven by equal parts curiosity and desperation, I let him inside. Dr. Crane explained everything over cups of lukewarm motel coffee. The homunculi weren't children or even human in any real sense. They were artificial beings created through alchemical means centuries ago by an obscure sect obsessed with unlocking forbidden knowledge. These tiny constructs were designed to serve their creators without question, but over time, something had gone terribly wrong. They became autonomous, Crane said carefully, as if choosing his words with great care. They developed minds of their own, and appetites. Appetites? My stomach churned at his tone. "They feed on fear," he said simply. "It sustains them like food does for us." I stared at him in disbelief. "So what do they want from me?" "To consume you," he said bluntly before softening his tone slightly. "But not physically. They don't need flesh or blood like traditional predators do." He hesitated before continuing. "They'll break you down piece by piece until there's nothing left but terror, and then they'll move on. Drastic times call for drastic measures." Or so Crane claimed when he proposed his solution, confronting them head-on using ancient rituals designed not to destroy but banish them back into whatever void birthed them originally. A process fraught with danger given how much power these creatures had already gained over me emotionally/psychologically. I stared at Dr. Crane, my hands gripping the edge of the motel table so tightly my knuckles turned white. "You want me to confront them? Are you insane? I can barely look at them without wanting to crawl out of my own skin." He leaned forward, his sunken eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me want to shrink back. "If you don't confront them, they'll never stop. They'll keep feeding on your fear until there's nothing left of you. You'll become hollow." The word hung in the air like a threat, and I felt its weight settle in my chest. Hollow. The idea of being reduced to an empty shell terrified me more than the creatures themselves. I swallowed hard and nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. "What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Crane reached into his battered leather satchel and pulled out a small, ancient-looking book bound in cracked black leather. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with spidery handwriting that looked more like scratches than words. "This," he said, placing the book on the table between us, "contains the ritual. It's not easy, and it's not safe, but it's your only chance." I glanced down at the book, my stomach twisting into knots. "What if it doesn't work?" He hesitated for just a moment, long enough for doubt to creep in, before answering. "Then they'll take you." That night, I returned to my apartment for the first time since fleeing it 2 days earlier. The air inside felt heavy and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak louder. I clutched Dr. Crane's book to my chest like a lifeline as I moved through the darkened rooms. The ritual required specific items: candles, salt, a mirror, despite their absence from your request. This was Crane's instruction, and something personal, something tied to me that would anchor the spell. I gathered what I needed with trembling hands, all too aware of the faint scratching sounds coming from just outside the windows. They knew I was back. By midnight, everything was ready. I had drawn a circle of salt in the center of my living room and placed 4 black candles at its cardinal points. My personal item, a silver locket my mother had given me years ago, lay in the center of this circle alongside an open page from Crane's book. I lit the candles one by one, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with each passing second until I could see my breath misting in front of me, and then they came. At first, it was just one, a single homunculus creeping out from beneath my couch like a spider emerging from its web. Its black eyes glinted in the candlelight as it crawled toward me on all fours, its movements unnervingly fluid and deliberate. Then another appeared from behind the curtains, and another from under the table. Soon they were everywhere, dozens of them surrounding me in a loose circle just beyond the line of salt. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes burned with hunger as they watched me intently. I forced myself to focus on the book in front of me, reciting the incantation Crane had taught me earlier that day. The words felt strange and foreign on my tongue, like trying to speak with a mouthful of ash. The homunculi didn't like it. As soon as I began chanting, they started moving closer, testing the boundaries of the salt circle with cautious steps. One reached out a skeletal hand toward the line but recoiled with a hiss when its fingers touched the grains. I kept chanting, my voice growing louder as desperation took hold. The air around me seemed to vibrate with energy, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of the ritual. That's when everything went wrong. The locket, the anchor for the spell, began to tremble where it lay in the center of the circle. At first, I thought it was working, that maybe I was finally gaining some control over these creatures. But then cracks began to form along its surface, tiny fissures that spread like spiderwebs until it shattered completely. The energy in the room shifted instantly, from oppressive to outright hostile, and suddenly all eyes were on me. The homunculi surged forward as one mass, their tiny hands clawing at an invisible barrier that seemed to be weakening by the second. Panic gripped me as I realized what had happened. Without an intact anchor for the spell, there was nothing keeping them at bay anymore. I scrambled backward out of instinct but tripped over one of the candles and fell hard onto my back outside of what remained of my protective circle. They were on me in an instant. Their touch wasn't physical, not exactly, but it felt like icy tendrils burrowing into my skin and wrapping around my bones. My vision blurred as waves of fear crashed over me, pure and unrelenting terror so intense it felt like drowning. I tried to fight back, to scream or thrash or do something, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was lie there as they tore into me piece by piece, not flesh or blood but something deeper, something essential. And then suddenly, they stopped. When I opened my eyes again, Dr. Crane was standing over me with an expression somewhere between relief and regret etched across his gaunt face. "You're lucky," he said quietly as he helped me sit up amidst what remained of my living room, a scene of utter chaos littered with overturned furniture and melted candle wax pooling on scorched wood floors. "Lucky?" My voice cracked under strain as tears streamed down unbidden cheeks. "How? They didn't finish," he explained simply before adding grimly. "But they will return eventually unless..." "Unless what?" Dr. Crane hesitated, his gaunt face shadowed in the dim light of the ruined room. He looked older now, more worn, as if the weight of what had just happened had aged him years in mere minutes. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he wrestled with whatever grim truth he was about to reveal. "Unless you give them what they want," he finally said. My stomach dropped. "What they want? I thought you said they feed on fear. Haven't they already taken enough?" He shook his head, his expression darkening. "Fear sustains them, yes, but it's not their ultimate goal. They're not just mindless predators, Gina. They're collectors." "Collectors?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "They take pieces of people," he explained. "Fragments of their identity, their essence. It's not just about terror, it's about ownership. They want to hollow you out so they can claim what's left." I stared at him in disbelief. my mind reeling. And you're saying I should let them do that? Just give up part of myself? No, he said firmly. Not entirely. But there's a way to bargain with them, to offer them something small in exchange for your freedom. He paused, his gaze heavy with meaning. It's dangerous, and it doesn't always work. But it's your best chance. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't told me this before we'd attempted the ritual. But deep down, I already knew the answer, because he hadn't been sure I'd survive long enough to need this information. What do I have to do? I asked again, my voice hollow. The second ritual was simpler than the first, but no less horrifying. Dr. Crane instructed me to sit in the center of the room while he drew a new circle around me. This one made not of salt but of ash mixed with something he refused to name. The air smelled acrid and sharp as he worked, muttering under his breath in that same strange language from the book. When he was finished, he handed me a small knife with a blade no longer than my finger. Its handle was wrapped in worn leather, and its edge gleamed unnaturally bright in the flickering candlelight. You'll need to make an offering, he said quietly. I stared at him, my heart pounding. An offering? What kind of something personal? He interrupted. Something tied to who you are, your memories, your identity. It doesn't have to be much, but it has to mean something. I looked down at the knife in my hand, its weight suddenly unbearable. The thought of cutting away even a small piece of myself, of willingly giving it to those things, made my skin crawl. But what choice did I have? The homunculi returned as soon as I began the ritual. They emerged from the shadows like smoke coalescing into solid form, their black eyes glittering with anticipation. This time there were more of them, too many to count, and they surrounded me in a tight circle just beyond the line of ash. I forced myself to meet their gaze as I raised the knife to my arm. My hands trembled so violently that I nearly dropped it, but somehow I managed to steady myself long enough to make the cut. It was shallow, barely more than a scratch, but it was enough. As soon as blood welled up from the wound, the air around me seemed to shift again, growing heavier and colder until it felt like I was being crushed under an invisible weight. The homunculi moved closer, their movements slow and deliberate as if savoring the moment. I closed my eyes and focused on what Dr. Crane had told me. Think about what you're offering them, what part of yourself you're willing to give. A memory surfaced unbidden, a fragment from my childhood that I hadn't thought about in years. Sitting on my grandmother's porch on a warm summer evening, listening to her hum an old tune while she braided my hair. It was small and insignificant compared to everything else that made me who I was, but it was mine, and now it would be theirs. When I opened my eyes again, the homunculi were gone. The room felt lighter somehow, as if a storm had passed, and for the first time in days, I could breathe without feeling like something was pressing down on my chest. Dr. Crane knelt beside me, his expression unreadable as he examined the cut on my arm. It worked, he said finally. I wanted to feel relief, to believe that this nightmare was over, but all I could think about was what I'd lost. That memory had been so small, so seemingly insignificant, yet its absence left an ache that felt far larger than it should have been. Will they come back? I asked quietly. Dr. Crane hesitated before answering, a hesitation that told me everything I needed to know. They always come back eventually, he admitted softly. But now you know how to deal with them. In the weeks that followed, life returned to something resembling normalcy, or at least as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. The homunculi didn't return, not yet, but their absence didn't bring peace. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those black eyes and two wide smiles that haunted my dreams even now. And every time I reached for another memory, some fleeting moment from my past, I couldn't help but wonder how much more they would take if they ever came back again. Because deep down, I knew they would. They always do.